When advising students writing master's theses or PhD dissertations, I urge them to avoid ambiguity at all costs. Research questions that include terms about which there is little common agreement, I warn them, are almost always non-operational in practice. I've ignored that advice today, choosing for my title 3 terms, we, landscape, and science, that demand some clarification. No one ever said that professors were consistent. What do I mean by these 3 words, and why have I chosen them? To start, take that innocuous word, we. This, I tell students, is term number 1 to avoid. There are multiple we's, after all. Every person belongs to many groups simultaneously. What's more, the relationships among these different groups are rarely equal. They're most often marked by differences of power, status, or authority. So whom, you may reasonably ask, do I have in mind? My answer is that there are at least 3 we's implicit in my title. No one ever said that professors couldn't hedge. The first, I would claim, is all of us, in the sense of humanity at large. This sentiment is perhaps grandiose or naive. Certainly it's unfashionable in this era of political and social fragmentation. And yet it is this ecumenical we I have in mind in these remarks, for that is ultimately what drives my work as a scholar and teacher. In this, I suspect I'm not so different from the people in this room. I suspect, or perhaps I should say I hope, that one of the prime motivations of scholarship is always the aspiration, however remote, to serve Homo sapiens, one species among many on this planet, at a particular moment in its history. And yet, like all rhetoric, this big we soon dissolves into generality and cliché. It belongs to manifestos, not to science. It's finally those many smaller we's of which we are part that we make a difference in and find meaning in our lives. So it is that the real subject and audience of these remarks is 2 narrower collectives. The first of these is an institutional one. We find ourselves in a specialized university with a singular mission. This mission is familiar to me. I have taught in 2 so-called land-grant schools in the United States, institutions that are similar to SLU in many ways. Like SLU, those schools were founded to produce and disseminate technical and scientific knowledge for innovation in agriculture. Unlike SLU, however, many developed into large and diversified universities. In Sweden, by contrast, the original land-grant mission, as that would be called in the US, remained housed within a separate, smaller institution with that specific remit. This history helps to explain the ratio of research staff to students at SLU, which at nearly 1-to-1, I understand, is far greater than in most general education universities. It also sheds light for a newcomer such as myself on the very clear line drawn here between research and teaching. The existence of that line suggests a 2-part vision of the university as a social institution. On the one hand, the university generates, through research, the new knowledge necessary to manage an ever more complex, urbanizing society. On the other hand, it equips people, that is to say, students, with the skills they will need to apply that knowledge as innovation, whether as researchers themselves or as entrepreneurs in the wider economy. Both these missions are underwritten by the notion of the university as a producer of knowledge and society as its consumer. This monodirectional model of knowledge flow has been, of course, weakening over the last 50 years. Universities today are generally far more open to the society's in which they are embedded than they were at that time. And yet, it has proven surprisingly resilient, particularly in light of the momentous political, social, and technological changes elsewhere in society. Indeed, in some ways, this model might be said to be more entrenched than ever, given the realities of professional advancement within academia today. Despite much talk of interdisciplinarity in recent years, in practice, the university remains, by and large, a collection of largely isolated subdomains of specialized knowledge production, each of which distributes, quote-unquote, outputs through its own established channels, usually scholarly journals rated for maximum impact. Operating outside or challenging the standards of these domains and channels, for example by publishing for general audiences or publishing exclusively online, can undo careers before they even begin. In this sense, the second we I have in mind here is not just an institutional one, but a professional one as well. And here we arrive at the third we, for I am a member of not just one profession, but two. This other profession, landscape architecture, is a small we indeed. 1,500 souls in Sweden, as I understand it, a mere 16,000 even in the United States with its 325 million inhabitants. Despite their small number, however, landscape architects have exerted a considerable influence in the shaping of the human environment over the last 2 centuries. From the invention of the public park, to the development of regional ecological planning, to the repurposing of the past for present needs and aspirations. And this is not to mention some of the most iconic garden and park designs of the last century, or indeed of this one. Throughout most of its modern history, landscape architecture has been grounded in real-world problems. It has always had impact. This has created a professional culture that not only accepts but values complexity. Landscape architecture has always been a both-and discipline, not an either-or one. Both nature and culture, both public and private, both local and global, both matter and idea. This refusal to accept the dichotomies that pervert so much of our shared political discourse and constrain so many of our individual preferences and values is perhaps the reason why the profession has experienced strong growth in recent decades. Something about landscape architecture just seems to answer to the ecological, political, and social crisis in which we now find ourselves. I've taught landscape architecture, as was mentioned, all over the world. But when I ask new students what drew them to the profession, I get more or less the same answer. Something is terribly amiss, students tell me, and this is the only discipline that seems capable of pointing toward a whole solution. This is often followed by something along the lines of, landscape architecture is the only profession that does not force me to choose between art and science. It is the one field that will allow me to engage my whole self. These answers are very close to the ones I would have given at the beginning of my own career as a landscape architect, and they remain the aspect of the profession I value most. But they also hint at why, despite its growth and increasing prominence, landscape architecture has never been a particularly easy fit in the institutional structures of universities or in the wider culture of academia. This is due in part, I have a hunch, to the fact that landscape architects spend a great deal of their time thinking and talking about timeless things. The shade of a tree on a summer day, the sound of water, the smell of cut grass, a child's laughter, apple blossoms falling in spring. Much of the landscape architect's work, perhaps paradoxically for a design discipline, is less about innovation than about constancy, about things that, dare I say it, should not change. It has never been easy to make the leap from these concerns to an academic research agenda that will enjoy legitimacy in a university as fixated on novelty as is the society around it. Excuse me. But this ill fit is also almost certainly a function of the basically hybrid nature of landscape architecture itself. While as a design discipline it shares certain affinities with architecture, which are linked to its historical choice of name, in practice, the field draws together a wide array of competences and disciplines, from botany to sociology to history to planning to engineering. Indeed, to enumerate the different realms of knowledge on which landscape architects depend in their daily work would be to test the credulity of those without direct experience of that work. Such defiance of easy categorization often results in uncertainty about the proper home of landscape architecture programs within the university. Landscape architecture is always something of an outlier wherever it is placed. In some universities, it is housed in schools of art. In others, in schools of agriculture and horticulture. In still others, among the social sciences. In a few cases, it even stands alone, a university unto itself. There are good reasons for each of these configurations, and each can be defended on the basis of a disciplinary history rooted in both the fine arts and the natural sciences. But this is also why, wherever landscape architecture does end up, its teachers and students almost always feel that something fundamental has been left out, that the whole discipline somehow cannot be accommodated within the institutional arrangements available to it. I've often found myself wondering about the degree to which all this is due to the word landscape itself. As greater minds than mine have discerned, this word is plagued, or blessed, by a signal lack of consensus about its meaning. Of course, meaning is always provisional, we know that, perhaps never so much as in this post-fact age. But even so, landscape is not a word like table or house. Depending on whom one talks to, it would seem capable of meaning almost anything. To the ecologist, it is nature, another slippery word. To the geographer, it is culture. To the art historian, it is a representation. To the archaeologist, it is an artifact. To the artist, it is experience. To the cultural critic, it's an ideology. To the politician, it's a metaphor. To the planner, it's a park. To the developer, it's a lawn. And to Google, well, it's that. This cacophony of meanings can make landscape difficult to operationalize in traditional research contexts. To those outside what might be called landscape disciplines, landscape architecture, but also geography, art history, archaeology, to name a few, the word can be exasperating, particularly when a case is being made for its methodological utility. How can you include landscape in a hypothesis, they ask, when people do not even agree about what it is? Landscape architects in the academy are aware of this problem. They value the word for its intuitive familiarity and resonance. That, they sense, is part of its power as method. But they struggle mightily when asked to define, measure, or quantify this power for colleagues in fields less burdened by conceptual ambiguity than their own. And yet there is no shortage of university departments or programs with contestable names. Think of natural resources, cultural geography, or even environmental communication. The awkwardness of landscape architecture would seem to have to do not so much with some fatal ambiguity in its first term, as with the actual character of the knowledge creation within it, the methods used, the standards observed, the forms of dissemination practiced. It is these I want to talk about in a bit more detail now. There is, I find, a disconcerting subtext to many contemporary discussions about the degree to which landscape architecture is or is not becoming a quote-unquote research discipline. This involves a usually implicit, but sometimes explicit, jump from the assertion that landscape architecture is interdisciplinary, true, as I've noted, to the assertion that it has no real research methods of its own at all, and must therefore borrow these from other, more established disciplines. This position is espoused, or at least accepted, even by landscape architects. I recall a panel on research I sat on at a recent landscape architecture educators conference, where one of the other panelists, a sociologist, confidently declared that the problem with landscape architecture was that its methods were quote-unquote poorly developed. To my surprise, this comment elicited no protest from a packed room of landscape architects. We are, it would seem, ever a polite discipline. Well, I said then, and will say again now, methods may be marginal, they may be strange, they may not fit with the conceptions of research or the structures of institutions in a given time or place, but this does not mean they are not methods. Landscape architecture has existed as a discipline for nearly 2 centuries, in which time it has developed a rich methodological tradition of its own, a tradition that continues to evolve with the changing social and ecological tasks its practitioners take on. There is no sense in which its methods are poorly developed. What they are, undeniably, is different from the specialized knowledge production that, by and large, still dominates the university today. Landscape architecture is by its very nature incommensurable with specialization. Landscape architects are generalists by temperament and by principle. We, are comfortable with ambiguity and instinctively resist reducing the world to simple 2-variable correlations or merely instrumental relationships. We are interested in understanding both how things are put together in the world as a made thing, an artifact, and in why they are put together, in the tendency of that artifact, whatever and wherever it is, to mean. In a world of standardization, we embrace particularity and difference, the fact that this meaning will always depend on the histories, characteristics, and habits of real places at specific times. But we also believe, as I said earlier, that the things that matter are somehow always timeless. We are both constructivists and structuralists. And as designers, we are interested not only in understanding the world, but also in envisioning it differently, better, in accordance with these values. This yields methods that are basically inductive in character, rooted in observation of the world around us. We begin every project in the field, in a state of heightened attention to the phenomena available to our senses, a hungry alertness to both the strange and, even more, the ordinary. Why is that wall this high and not that high? Why are those people standing there? Where will the water go? What's that smell and what activity is producing it? Who lived here before? How long will that foundation last? Where do animals cross this highway? What do people think of those benches? Such questions, which are second nature for the practiced landscape architect, generally come in quick succession and in no particular order, but they are anything but random. What we are out to find always are the connections between processes and products, the social and the biophysical, the material and the political, the seen and the unseen, the stuff out there and the thinking self in here. And, generally speaking, we are never so happy as when these connections surprise or astound us. We do not mind paradox. We are comfortable dwelling in a world that, we thank the stars above, is finally irreducible to our models of it. This perhaps is why we are so promiscuous in taking models from others. We do this not for the sake of interdisciplinarity as a good in itself, not because we think that one discipline has some answer that we lack, but rather because doing it ensures us against all those overly simple connections that seduce the mind but falsify the world. We are constantly aware of how little we control the variables to which the things we design and make are subject. Perhaps more than in any other profession, we always work with emergence and change, particularly today, when even modest assumptions about the state of the planet in decades, not centuries, are in doubt. This demands a high tolerance for ambiguity and incomplete information, a capacity to press on despite it all, to avoid being overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of the world as it is, before arriving at conclusions about the world as it might be. The skills we impart to students, accordingly, can look chaotic or slipshod to those unfamiliar with them. Perhaps no other field so completely embodies the notion of design as, in the words of Kevin Lynch, an irrational search. When people look into our teaching studios, particularly in the early stages of a course or project, what do they see? What must they be thinking? They just rush around, doing this and that. First they look at a satellite photo, then they read a report, then they doodle, then they stare at a photograph, then they go outside and look at lichen on a tree, then they pace the halls, then they cut up and glue some cardboard, then they look out the window, then they open a novel on their desk and mark something with a red pen, more scribbling, then they close their eyes. Then they go online looking for articles on wetland ecology or art history or climate change. Wait, is that person actually crying? One could be forgiven for seeing in such behavior a profound lack of method, an ignorance of where to begin, a striking inability to tackle problems logically and systematically. And yet it is a method. We know this, because we teach that method to hundreds of students each year. The reason it risks not being seen as such is not some inherent antipathy among our academic colleagues, many of whom would likely recognize its similarity to the creative aspect in their own work. It is rather our, and here I mean very specifically landscape architects, failure to explain it. To an extent, this failure is understandable. Because we know the value and power of this method, we assume that these are self-evident to others. But in that case, we can hardly be surprised when our practices are met with occasional raised eyebrows. Without better articulation of the rationale behind these practices as a way of creating knowledge, in language understandable not just within but across disciplines and specializations, there is simply no way to argue for their value to the institutions in which we operate. We must therefore learn to translate not just forward from the terms of other disciplines into our own, but back again as well. And this is where I come to that last freighted word in my title. For I have in mind a definition of this word that differs from that which currently obtains in common English usage. I want to recover an older definition, one based on the Latin scientia, meaning simply knowledge. In its earliest forms in English, science meant simply knowledge or understanding acquired by systematic study, or acquaintance with or mastery of any branch of learning. These older senses are preserved in the name of academic fields such as political science, as well as in colloquial usage. Think of having gardening, or cleaning, or train spotting down to a science. And they are still standard in other languages. Italian, for example, has no problem calling the humanities Scienze Humane. The German Wissenschaft, Swedish Vetenskap, is a word generous enough to contain the sculptor and the mathematician, the philosopher and the biologist, the designer and the physicist, despite the enormous differences in the ways these scientists create and share knowledge. In this more generous sense, science is capable of gathering all of them into a common project, one devoted to seeking truth in all its forms. That, for me, is the essence of what a university should be. What I envision, then, is a landscape science. This science would be a both-and science. It would be both rooted in the methods I have described here and meet standards of rigor, evidence, and reflexivity that obtain in the university as a whole. It would be syncretic and synthetic, gathering up and mediating among disciplines that might otherwise never encounter one another. It would be both positive and normative, concerned with both understanding the world and envisioning change. And, perhaps most important, it would banish the distinction between research and teaching, theory and practice, a distinction that is, at best, unhelpful, at worst, wholly untenable in a design field. This science, I'm happy to say, is already emerging. The last several years have seen a number of notable efforts to theorize landscape architecture research as a distinct and rigorous form of knowledge creation. And yet these efforts are still the exception. Calls for a research agenda within landscape architecture remain, in my view, implicitly or explicitly biased against the native methods, standards, and outcomes of this discipline. We, again, landscape architects, have been, I think, rather too focused on the enterprise of proving the value of things that we do well through analogy to things that we do not do well, but that already enjoy the legitimacy we crave. We are generally not yet doing the much harder work of setting out clearly and explicitly what we do, then arguing for its value and legitimacy, for its status as science in its own right. This vision of a landscape science is not only a challenge to the we of landscape architecture, however. It is also a challenge to the modern university, both this one and the university in general. It is a call to not merely accept or tolerate, but to encourage and reward the full range and diversity of knowledge creation within that university. It is a call to pledge ourselves to the shared mission of searching for truth without prejudice to method, and to rethink all the institutional divisions that constrain this search. Finally, it is a call for a more open university in all the senses of that word, one rooted in recognition of what landscape architects, both inside and outside academia, have always known, that whatever science we happen to practice, we have far more to learn from the world than to teach it. I look forward to building that university with you in the years to come. Thank you.